This is the story of Concorde, specifically the aircraft named Alpha Delta and its intrepid journey. Our story begins on the Hudson River on the west side of New York. There, the Intrepid, a World War II aircraft carrier, is the centerpiece of a museum dedicated to exploring sea, air, and space history. The museum will become the final resting place for Concorde Alpha Delta, one of only 14 supersonic passenger jets ever made. But why the Intrepid? Its collection includes some of the fastest machines ever made. But more, the reasons fall to the very core of the museum's mission, to celebrate the humanity behind the hardware.
It's a great pleasure for British Airways to be here today as we have what we think is a fantastic announcement to make.
Understanding the saga of supersonic transport is key to appreciating Alpha Delta as a truly great gift. Transporting the aircraft will be an engineering marvel in itself and a tale of new beginnings. But SST passenger travel is a story of legendary endings. We'll explore the odyssey of Concorde's history within this chronicle of its final journey. It's interesting to note that the small Concorde fleet has clocked more flight hours at Mach speed than all of the jets in all the world's air forces combined. Ironic, since the military was the primary force behind the development of supersonic travel.
Because of how much noise he made, there were certain runway configurations he couldn't go off on, made our jobs a little more complicated. But the guys who flew it were great, always good to work with. JetBlue 53, Breezy Point, Clyde, call New York departure, get up.
There we are, 20 miles.
It's an airplane, true, but it represents that technology which is gone now. And who knows when you'll see it again.
The call sign of all the letters, GB080. That's Speedbird Concorde Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Delta Kennedy Tower following heavy Boeing 767 3-mile final with 230 at 8, runway 31 right, clear land.
Clear land, 31 right, and we'd like to roll to the end after landing. Is anybody following this?
No, sir. Proceed as requested.
Alpha Delta.
The last Concorde arrival in the United States.
The first step in our final journey will be to move Concorde Alpha Delta to a hangar where it will be decommissioned by the very engineering team that kept her flying. Concorde represents much more than an aircraft to this team. To the French, and especially to the British, Concorde's creation became a national priority, born of the fear created by World War II. Her survival was tied directly to a mastery of aircraft technologies.
Okay, you want to run through the checklist real quick? Okay, batteries on flight test complete. Hydraulics 1 4 off loaded. Port sleeve 1 4 open. Engine feed pumps 1 4 all on. Right fans off until engine start.
Okay, we still need some ground support from Hudson General.
I think during the war there was this fascination with the speed of sound. Both sides of the Atlantic wanted to do something about it.
And all the military aircraft were going through the sound barrier, so everybody thought, well, is there a possibility of actually taking a passenger transport at that speed? Many people thought you couldn't achieve it.
It's easy enough to have one man in an aircraft flying supersonically in a small aircraft, but to create a transport aircraft that carries 100, 200, 300 people was obviously quite a technological challenge.
The British felt that it was time, as Boeing took over that market for traditional subsonic aircraft, it was time for Britain to lead the world and create the next generation of aircraft.
The concept of it was built around a commercial idea, a commercial need to keep British aerospace at the forefront. Secondly, I think many of the politicians of that day understood the need to create dreams. They understood the need to keep the population who voted for them motivated, to keep them looking forward, looking ahead, to keep them happy, to keep them dreaming. And Concorde, if nothing else, has been a thing of dreams since then.
don't think we're ever going to see supersonic or nothing like that. This is it. This is a glimpse into the future. It's over.
The research showed they could build a supersonic aircraft. As soon as it was shown that the next generation of aircraft would be possible, the government very quickly agreed to actually put the money forward to enable a program to start.
The engineers will decommission Concorde Alpha Delta and prepare it for the Intrepid Museum in just 5 days. In addition, the 4 massive Syncma Olympus 593 engines will have to be removed due to the weight restrictions of the cranes that will lift her onto a waiting barge in Jamaica Bay.
Is it? Last one. You ready to go?
To do it together, Paulie?
Let's. You ready? On 3. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, okay.
This is it. Long journey, and it ends here.
The engineers' time with their beloved aviation icon grows short. By 1959, it became apparent that the SST project, although feasible, was going to require partnership. The British wanted an American company that would help ensure a more profitable market share, but the U.S. companies wanted to go it alone. The French also needed a partner because of the costs and because Rolls-Royce was much farther along on a high-powered jet engine. However, the British wanted to become a part of the newly emerging European economic community. And a technological partnership with the French was just the thing to show Britain no longer wanted to be an empire.
Britain and France had commercial aircraft programs, and they were both moving the same way. And eventually, I think each realised that the development costs of producing an aircraft like that was perhaps beyond either of them alone.
It was natural for them to get together, to merge their projects. And this is what eventually became Concorde.
Hundreds of millions of pounds were sanctioned to be spent on this project before the actual aircraft manufacturers even agreed actually what they were building.
One side wanted a medium transport, and the other side wanted a long-range transport. And so eventually there had to be a compromise.
After weeks and weeks of meetings in Paris between bureaucrats who couldn't agree on anything, Dr. Strang, who was the BAC engineer, was taken away by the French engineer, and these two guys together sat in an office for one day and finally came up with a design that they could agree on.
I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised, when I found that the Concorde Alpha Delta, which was going to New York, wasn't actually going to be taken apart. The only major thing we did was take the 4 engines out. We're actually getting the engine doors open. You see now they're actually putting jacks on the doors, and they're getting the doors right open. That gives us full access to the engines. We actually had a checklist. I think it was around about a 13-page checklist. This is the sheet we'll be working to. One of the main things was actually to remove a lot of the pressurised containers, dinghies, the life rafts, life jackets. They've all got pressurised containers, and these are all taken off and discharged.
Well, the British and the French governments negotiated a contract between them which no sensible business executive would ever agree to.
When the Labour government came in 1964, they tried to cancel it.
If Britain had withdrawn from it, as they intended to at one time, they'd have still had to carry on paying the French the cost of carrying on.
It was very clever, and clearly the people that put it together wanted the project finished.
And actually, ironically, it was Julian Amery, who was the British minister who negotiated that contract in the first place. He was the guy who actually made Concorde happen through his mistrust of the French.
In 1963, President Kennedy decided to concentrate on the space program and not support an American SST project. But Pan American Airline President Juan Trippe announced he was buying 6 Concordes just a day before JFK was to give a major speech.
I'm announcing today that the United States will commit itself to an important new program in civilian aviation.
The American SST program was more ambitious than the British and French. The American SST was going to be faster, maybe 3 times the speed of sound, was going to carry more people.
Boeing's decided to go for Mach 3, which was new materials, even greater technology.
The Americans weren't the only ones getting into the SST game. Nikita Khrushchev demanded a supersonic transport first, whatever the costs. Dubbed Concorde due to alleged KGB espionage efforts, the Russians went from virtually no knowledge of SST technology to beating the Europeans into the air. But it was a short-lived victory due to engine inefficiencies and safety problems. The French prototype 001 flew 3 months later, followed by the British-built 002 a month after that. SST flight was becoming a reality as construction began on the production aircraft. Engines and systems were handled by the British, airframe and structure by the French. Final assembly took place in both countries. It was a dinosaur of an organization to produce a greyhound of an aircraft, but national pride continued to blind the Anglo-French management.
There was a certain degree of commercial naivety within the entire commercial operation of the early Concorde. Stories on the front page of many a British newspaper talking about Japan Airlines buying Concordes or Pan Am buying Concordes. Pan Am were the first airline in the world to apparently buy a Concorde. In reality, they paid a few £100 or a few £1,000 to have the right to buy a Concorde before anyone else.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Perhaps it was, in the Europeans' view, their Apollo program. Perhaps it was their way of demonstrating technological superiority.
Unlike the space race, the supersonic project was looked at as a commercial project that would propel the UK and France into the forefront of civil aviation and generate a handsome return on the public investment. But times were changing.
The Vietnam War was the most controversial war since the Civil War in this country. Protesting had become far more organized. The power of protesting had been demonstrated in the society through the Vietnam years.
The environmental movement rose in the 60s, and we were just then coming to grips with environmental issues of that type. We were just learning what the ozone layer was.
It was becoming more and more difficult for politicians, particularly Richard Nixon, an SST advocate, to keep the American supersonic transport project afloat. Congressional appropriations were examined with increasing frequency and scrutiny.
There was a strong anti-supersonic transport lobby in Congress. Eventually in March 1971, I think, Congress decided not to stump up any money.
Your attention, please. The full Senate has just voted to delete the SST fund from the Department of Transportation bill.
The American supersonic transport program ended up costing as much as Concorde to that point, yet we never got a plane off the ground.
$190 million is not at all. Thank you.
The end result was in fact a social catastrophe for the United States. 7,000 people at Boeing lost their jobs working on the project. 6,000 people at engine manufacturer General Electric lost their jobs. So in the end, it turned out quite a disaster, really.
That would have opened up all sorts of opportunities throughout the world for supersonic travel. The fact that the Americans stopped doing it was a really bad news.
My grandfather thought it was a great waste of money. He was totally against the Concorde. He had seen where we can harm our quality of life through uses of technology. We can help our quality of life through technology.
Charles A. Lindbergh first made his thoughts about supersonic transport public in a July 27, 1972 op-ed piece in the New York Times. Lindbergh was a director of and consultant to Pan American World Airways at the time. Perhaps in these last years before his death, he influenced the future of supersonic travel more than history gives credit.
There was the intention of building up to 200 Concordes. There was a belief that at least 200 could be shipped. And in fact, at one point, there were almost 90 options or orders which were actually placed to actually buy Concorde jets.
Concorde could be operated economically with a 10% uplift over first-class fare. When the oil crisis happened, that wasn't feasible anymore.
Fuel is a necessity for speed. The faster you go, the more fuel you need. In late 1972, the cost of fuel wasn't a concern. But when the Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War broke out in 1973, the price of oil quadrupled overnight. The Arab oil-producing countries placed an embargo on fuel exports, and the world was plunged into a recession and extraordinary inflation.
The tragedy, though, for the British and the French teams building these planes was that Pan Am, the first airline to option Concordes, also decided to be the first airline to cancel them. When Pan Am decided to actually cancel those planes and cancel those orders, every airline around the world started to actually question the plane's economics again.
And essentially it left only British Airways and Air France, and they didn't really have any choice.
The two national airlines agreed to each take 7 Concordes off the first production batch. At this point, the reality set in that there might only be 14 production aircraft ever produced.
The greatest challenge of creativity, as I see it, lies ahead.
Watergate was finally over. The country had survived. But President Gerald Ford knew there was an underlying mistrust of government left in the wake. Everything had to be done by the book, especially something as sensitive as landing permits for Concorde. In September 1975, a phone book-sized report on the Concorde's potential drawbacks arrived at the door of community leaders living near New York Kennedy Airport. To many, it was the first time they had ever heard of the aircraft.
It was terrible. I mean, it absolutely condemned the Concorde. It said it was noisier, dirtier, especially on takeoff.
When I took office, the filing had already been made, and I soon found in the file a memorandum signed, I think, by President Nixon, saying that any decision on this would be made in the White House rather than the Department of Transportation. And I told President Ford that in my judgment that it would be better that I would decide the matter, and he had one option, namely to fire me.
There were very successful pressure groups set up in the US and also in the UK, trying to do everything they could do to try and actually get Concorde stopped.
They wheeled out scientists that came up with all sorts of fanciful stories about skin cancer increases, ozone depletion, roofs being blown off, windows being shattered. Creatures in the States called Concorde an instrument of the devil. So the media whipped up an anti-Concorde frenzy.
We decided then to hold a public hearing, first writing a memorandum, putting out all the issues as we saw them, and then we had a day or two public hearings. So I really felt that as a public official, particularly one who was not elected to office but appointed to office, that you had a duty to put in writing why you were deciding controversial matters a certain way, hoping that the public would somehow accept the fact that you explained it in writing.
Secretary Coleman's decision allowed limited Concorde service in the U.S. for a 16-month test period. So on May 24, 1976, Air France and British Airways simultaneously began service to Washington, D.C. But just 12 days earlier, Concorde was banned from JFK International Airport, run by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. This final hurdle for Concorde started with the careful wording of the Coleman decision. It left open a key 200-year-old question. Should a federal decision overrule or preempt a state or local one?
1976, the Concorde intends to arrive in New York, and I think that the power of civil protest was fairly easily mobilized against that threat based on what happened in the 60s.
We were new environmentalists in those days, and we were going to say, and we didn't know quite what the ozone layer was, but we were going to save it anyway.
I asked the Secretary of Defense once, I said, how many supersonic airplanes do you have flying up every day? And I said, you have to tell me, but it's more than 8, isn't it? And he said, yes. So I said, well, you know, if you can fly U.S. supersonic airplanes up there, I don't understand why you can't fly a British plane up there.
Many thought that it was really only about nationalism. The American SST had never gotten off the ground, and it was the British, and especially the French, showing their muscle and showing off and landing at our airport and making this terrible bang.
Organizations all around came to join us and then meet us at various points, but we were throwing out, 1,000 cars out here. So we didn't block it. We didn't do dirty tricks.
I remember being at those protests with, 500, 600, 700 cars honking their way around Kennedy Airport.
We coordinated lots of people here. We made a mess out of this place and did it like gentlemen.
My father and the people who really believed that it was an important economic development tool for our city and our country, having the Concorde, land in New York City was very, very critical, and proved that he was right.
This was a bigger than a Howard Beach issue. This was a cosmopolitan issue, and that it was to New York's advantage to have landing in it the newest and fastest aeroplane.
Flies beautifully, but not this airport.
In 1977, Jimmy Carter was the new president, and he wasn't getting involved. He did, however, stand by the former Secretary of Transportation. Concorde's legal fight for New York rights became a complicated four-round event. 2 major cases and 2 visits to the Court of Appeals. Each time, the courts upheld that the record Secretary Coleman had made showed Concorde was safe for testing, and that environmental problems would be minimal. Chief Judge Irving R. Kaufman summed up the Port Authority's view in part of his ruling, which said, if ever there was a case in which a major technological advance was in imminent danger of being studied into obsolescence, this is it. But the Port Authority appealed again to the United States Supreme Court, and it refused to hear the case. So finally, on November 22, 1977, Air France and British Airways simultaneously began scheduled service from Paris and London, ironically, to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York.
We've been fighting about this forever, and now we were going to actually be able to sit on this airplane and fly from France to Kennedy to be greeted by this media mass.
I didn't quite know what to expect when the plane took off, what it would feel like to break the sound barrier.
We're at Mach 0.98, just under the speed of sound. Let's see what it feels like to break the sound barrier. Mach 0.99. And Mach 1.
Contrary to all those movies we've watched about Chuck Yeager, when he'd rattle and roll around in glamorous Glennis trying to break the sound barrier. Well, in this case, it was nothing. It was just a Mach meter that rolled through 1.0, and there we were.
The food on the way across was extraordinary. The French really pulled out all of the stops, and the service on the airliner was fantastic. And it was just an aura of great excitement.
We landed before we took off, which was also, at that day, on that moment, a remarkable feat.
And this was a first, a great first. This was a monumental event, I think, for the airline industry and for New York and for the French and the British. It was a halcyon day.
And when we touched down, there was a spontaneous, exuberant round of applause, a celebration of our uniqueness for having shared this historic event.
This was a controversy for decades. And in the end, this controversy went...
When the plane landed the first time, most people didn't even know that that it'd come in.
The New York Times reported exactly that. They said that some people thought it was actually quieter than regular jets. Although in fairness, on takeoff it was quite noisier than conventional jets at that time. But Concorde eventually passed the evaluation tests in New York and Washington and finally began regular service. Concorde loved to fly. In mock flight, her skin temperature approached the boiling point, actually expanding the airframe 6 to 10 inches in length. And because the heat continually anodized the aluminum, the aircraft's structure was still virtually like new. So when the engineers began to remove the engines, simply to shed extra weight so the cranes could lift her onto a barge, the mood suddenly changed.
Concorde's a one-off aeroplane. There's nothing to replace it. You're actually going backwards now. And there was the crews themselves, having flown Concorde. They're actually there's nothing to go on to. There's no advancement at all.
It gets into your stomach. You have an ill feeling in your stomach, like a flash.
It's a shame. Usually when you retire an aircraft, it's because a new and better one has come along. If there isn't a new one or a better one comes, the funeral. They can, just it's sweet because everything is gone. There's nothing left. And it's
machine. It really is. They put everything they could back on the airplane. They didn't want to see anything parted from the airplane. It was almost like having a body killed in a road accident. They'd taken the heart out and various organs to see why the patient had died, and at the end they put it all back before the burial. It was very sad, actually.
The plan is to take the aircraft out onto the extended section of the taxiway, right by runway 22 right, 4 left, and put her right by the water's edge of Jamaica Bay, and then bring alongside a large barge and physically lift Concorde onto the barge, and then sail the barge around under the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge and on into New York and up the Hudson and alongside the Intrepid. The final voyage of Concorde will be very different to the ones that she's made so often. Perhaps the slowest voyage she's ever made, but it'll certainly be one of the most spectacular.
Moving the Concorde from JFK Airport to the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum was not going to be easy. Planning had started weeks earlier. Issues from security to weather had to be carefully evaluated with plans for every contingency. It took the efforts of hundreds of dedicated individuals working to make sure that Concorde Alpha Delta, this extraordinary example of what humanity can accomplish, would be preserved. As Alpha Delta was towed down the runway at 1 mile an hour, the JFK Tower chiefs turned up the runway lights full in tribute. The Air France and British Airways Concordes always held a special place in the hearts of the aeronautical community at JFK. After a series of management changes in the 80s, Concorde finally became profitable for British Airways and gave them more than 18 golden years.
Concorde's been all over the world now. We've visited over 250 destinations worldwide, 76 of those in the United States alone. Of course, our major scheduled destinations were New York and Barbados, but on special flights we've been everywhere from quick trips around the bay to 23-day air cruises around the world, visiting many exotic places and always drawing huge crowds of admirers.
Celebrities loved Concorde, but against popular belief, the rich and famous only made up a small part of the regular customers. International business travelers made up the majority of daily Concorde passengers. But as the turn of the century approached, a series of events would spiral a premature end for Concorde. The most drastic was the freak accident of an Air France Concorde on July 25, 2000. The first and only catastrophic accident for Concorde was caused by a series of mistakes and miscalculations and a simple piece of metal on the runway.
It pierced the tyre, and as soon as that was pierced, the tyre flew upwards into the undercarriage and created holes in the bottom of the Concorde, which fuel then flowed out of. And sadly, that fuel ignited.
The two airlines invested millions to get Concorde back in service within 16 months. And with those new safety modifications in place, the Concorde received its airworthiness decree and has resumed normal service. The aircraft will be made ready for lifting off the runway and placement onto the barge that would take it to the Intrepid Museum. The location for this pick was key. It had to be somewhere that Concorde and the cranes could gain easy access, plus the depth of the water had to be just right for the barge. In addition, crews had to engineer the proper equipment and rigging gear. They made it look so simple.
The distance we had to swing the Concorde over to the barge was approximately 50 feet. The Concorde, and its without its fuel and its engines, worked out so we were within tolerance.
When we were going to sign for and become legally responsible for the aircraft was a point of some debate prior to the agreement, and so we agreed that once they grabbed a hold of the aircraft with the crane equipment, I had to sign for the aircraft, and at that moment in time, it became the responsibility of the Intrepid Museum. Well, he's not going to sign it until after I sign it.
Thank you very much, Colonel. Thanks for the airplane. Pleasure to get you in there.
As for the future of the supersonic aircraft, British Airways hopes it will wind up in museums where the Concorde can live on in the human imagination.
The Concorde was never about mass transportation, never about efficiently moving people from one place to another. It burned as much fuel to carry 100 people as a 747 did to carry 400 or 500 people. So if you're talking about fuel factor 4 and 5 times per seat, it doesn't make a lot of sense economically, and it never did.
Air France has never really made money from Concorde operations at all. It's kept it in the sky because it was a flagship plane. BA, on the other hand, made almost £1 billion profit in the heyday.
It was nice carrying the celebrities and royalties, but the businessmen really used to keep it flying. And once they stopped flying, then that was really probably the start of the end.
I want to get it centered. What I want to do for the pick itself is get you to take about 40 tons, Mark to take about 3 or 4 tons. Just make sure we're centered with the burning of the boom and all that with the 1225. Then I want you to take the whole load. Try and just get the wheel so they're just about inching off, then get Mark to inch off so that we're all clear and level, and then just leave it like that, or just rest it down a touch so that we're ready to go.
When it rolled out onto the runway and we saw that thing getting rigged with slings and lifted, it was a truly, truly emotional experience. And you realized that this was, in a sense, the last flight of the Concorde.
New York was the one airport that Concorde visited most often. There were more Concorde flights into and out of New York than anywhere else in the world. So we were very keen that New York was represented.
But we had to prove that we could take care of it, that we would be take care of it not just physically, but take care of it as an icon of British and French aerospace industry and national pride.
So what more could we ask for than having one of the pride of the British Airways fleet homed right in New York, right where Concorde operated most often?
Yeah, I think one of the critical components of our mission, and certainly what we're looking to make a statement about, is that the importance of what went on in the Intrepid was all about the heroism, and that's what we want the public to see. We want, families to come on and the kids to see that you can be a hero in your everyday life.
The weather starts to turn bad in the month of November. So in order to prepare what we needed to do, we only had 4 months, which isn't a lot of time. At most, we had 2 windows a month when we had a good high tide to bring the barge in next to the runway as close as possible. And number 2, a good low tide after that, so we could get it on the bridges.
It took just over 60 years to go from the first flight of the Wright brothers to the first flight of Concorde. Are we really going to go another 60 years before we see another supersonic aeroplane?
With Concorde, we surmise that something as simple as economics and accounting formulas can't be the only reason for retirement. There must be something more. We can't step backwards. So we create justifications, stories, and illusions for ourselves. Like other great icons, we just can't bring ourselves to accept such a simple explanation as economics. The future of air travel really all comes back to fuel, as many things in the world today do. But there are exciting developments in hypersonic air-breathing aircraft and a spirit within the aeronautical community that strives to find answers and push us forward. Thus, the question, why did they retire Concorde and end supersonic travel, may haunt us a while longer. Triumph that defined them both. Concorde and the Intrepid are not simply feats of technology. They are feats of humanity, and a testament to the heroism of those who left their mark on history in order to make the future just a little bit better for the rest of us.